Alright, so now we're going to pick up with our last section on the coelomate invertebrates, and we're going to talk about the annelids. So from there, the annelids actually are the last group of worms that we're going to talk about. They are these segmented worms. And of all the different groups of things that we call worms that we've talked about, this is the most complex group. They've got the most unique features, they've got the most specialization, they're the most complex. They have, of course, repeated bodies units. We talked about this back in the first chapter where we covered animals. We talked about segmentation. The annelids are a classic segmented animal, and each of those segments can be used to do different things. It also makes them somewhat redundant so that if one segment or segments are damaged, then others can kind of pick up the slack and the animal can survive. So it's very much a defining feature of this group as well as an advantageous feature for this group to have segmentation. Now, that last bullet point there about not being monophyletic, really what that means is that taxonomists feel pretty strongly that there are currently annelids classified as other things that really should be classified as annelids. And so it's one of those things where this group perhaps has lost a lot of the really, really obvious segmentation on the outside of the body, and so maybe it was classified with some other group because the taxonomist a long time ago thought that it wasn't really segmented, when in fact its ancestors were segmented and it lost those segments as a part of the evolutionary process. Very likely that is the case for some annelids that are out there. So we talked about specialization of segments. Segments can be specialized to do different things, whether it's feeding, reproduction, excretion, breathing, moving in some cases. It kind of depends on the worm you're talking about there, but they have segments that can do all of these different kinds of things. And because they have so many, they have a lot of opportunity for further specialization over evolutionary time. Um, the segments in an earthworm, for example, are what are described as being septate, and really all that means is if you or when you dissect an earthworm on the inside, when you look from one segment to the next, you're going to see there's a bit of a barrier between the segments. Now, obviously, it's not a complete barrier because then you wouldn't be able to have continuous digestive tracts and reproductive tracts and those kinds of things, but it is a partial separation from one segment to the next that's walled off by what's called a septum. So a septum in biology is a very generic term for a divider of some kind. These segments are septate and they're somewhat divided from one to the next. In the annelids, there are about 12,000 species. Most of the time, there is going to be very slight cephalization. So if you think about an earthworm, which most people have seen some species or another of earthworm, there's hundreds of species at least of earthworms, but it's really kind of hard to tell the front end from the back end unless you really know what you're looking for. But for other groups, like this fireworm in this picture, they actually do have a somewhat more distinguishable head at one end that contains things like sensory structures and feeding structures and those kinds of things. Now, the annelids are also the group that has the most specialization of a digestive tract, and so they're described as being a tube within a tube. They have a digestive tract, which of course is a long, skinny, primarily intestine, but a few other things like crop and gizzard and so forth, that's surrounded by a tubular body. So it's a tube within a tube. Now, that being said, it sounds relatively simple, but if you look at a dissection of an earthworm, even through the GI tract, you're going to have a pharynx, you're going to have a slight esophagus, you're going to have a crop, a gizzard, intestines. Fairly complex digestive tract compared to most of the animals that we've seen so far. The annelids actually are one of the more advanced when it comes to digestion. All right, so another picture of a fireworm here. Annelids are really, aside from the cephalopods that we looked at a few sections ago, the annelids are one of the only groups of invertebrates that share a closed circulatory system. So they have their blood inside of veins, so it can be moved around preferentially inside of the body to whichever part needs it the most at a certain point in time, just like we do. They do gas exchange through diffusion, so there are no lungs or gills or anything like that in the annelids. They do all their breathing across the surface of their skin, which is, kind of necessitates a couple of things. Number one, the body has to be long and skinny, so it's got to be cylindrical, which gives it more surface area compared to its volume, and therefore they're able to respire across their skin. The other thing that needs to be true is that their skin, the respiratory surface, has to be kept moist, otherwise it dries out and gas exchange stops. Right. So we mentioned this before, I believe when we covered the mollusks, but if a respiratory surface dries out, gas exchange stops. And so since the annelids use their skin as a respiratory surface, their skin has to be kept wet all the time. If it dries out, they can't breathe, and of course they suffocate. The annelids have what are called nephridia, which are going to collect and transport metabolic waste. These are similar to the protonephridia we saw back when we covered the flatworms. They are essentially the analog to our kidneys. They're doing the same kind of thing, filtering blood of waste, and also osmoregulation is taking place as well. In terms of movement, this group has both circular and longitudinal muscles. So if we think back to, say, the nematodes, for example, of course, they just had the longitudinal muscles. They did not have circular muscles, so that gave them that eel-like movement pattern. Annelids have both types of muscles, so their movement patterns are going to be a bit more complex. They do have a cerebral ganglion, which is just a collection of neurons kind of up in the front anterior end. Not really so advanced or specialized that you might call it a brain, but it is a collection of nervous tissue, which in some ways does serve some localized control like a brain might in some organisms. In terms of skeletons, all of the annelids have a hydrostatic skeleton. So again, we're talking about providing pressure against a fluid-filled space, and that fluid-filled space offering resistance back in the other direction. We talk about locomotion a lot, and when we cover locomotion as a chapter, part of the musculoskeletal system, we're going to see actually some more details about how earthworms actually move through the soil. But because they have both muscle types, what they're able to do is to alternately move or contract the circular and longitudinal muscles, and that allows them to move through the soil in a very efficient fashion, very, very efficient movement pattern. They have what are called chaetae, which are bristles. Sometimes they're also called setae. But these are just projections that poke off into either the water or the soil, depending on where they're living. If it's a soil-living organism, it's going to allow the organism to anchor that part of the body in place in the soil. If it's an aquatic organism, a lot of times those chaetae can be used for defense. They can also be used for gas exchange because they provide a whole lot more surface area to allow for oxygen, excuse me, and CO2 exchange to take place. We talked about the nephridia. And as we're going to see, a lot of the annelids are monoecious. They're hermaphroditic, and they are simultaneously so. So they're both male and female at the same time, although in most cases, they have to still cross-fertilize. They're not able to fertilize themselves like a tapeworm might be able to do. They still have to find a mate, but because everybody is both male and female, they don't have to worry about finding a female if they're a male or finding a male if they're a female. Because everybody is both, it's much easier to locate a mate. And so we've got just a little bit of a view here of the inside of the anteriormost part of an earthworm. The anterior part is usually the part closest to this broad band on the body called the clitellum. This structure is used to create a mucus cocoon when it comes time for breeding, for the eggs to be protected inside of. But the clitellum is a kind of a good indicator of where the front end is. The closer it is to one end, the more likely that end is going to be the head. So if we look inside here, we've got the mouth, the pharynx, the esophagus. The crop and gizzard aren't shown in this picture. The crop essentially is like a stomach in an organism, and a gizzard is usually a hard muscular structure, oftentimes with little bits of grit inside of it, and what that's used for is to grind up food particles, almost like teeth, really. The food particles inside the gizzard are ground up by the contractions of that structure until the point where they're actually smaller nutrients. And then from there is the intestine. Now that's the digestive tract, but we also have, blood vessels, nephridia, nervous tissue, both male and female gonads, hearts, very loosely defined here, but for a few segments you find one heart per segment, but nowhere near as complex as like a vertebrate heart or even a cephalopod heart for that matter. All right, so now we're going to look at the classes of annelids, and the first class that we're going to look at is the polychaeta. So the polychaetes, quite often, really they're called polychaetes just kind of as a common name as well. They're sometimes called lugworms. I've heard that used, in the setting of like a scuba dive or snorkeling trip, that kind of a thing. Two worms I've heard as well. I've never heard clamworms, scaleworms, or sea mice used. Those might be names used in other parts of the world. I don't know. But polychaetes or bristleworms are kind of a common name for this group. They're all marine, and this is the group that has the most cephalization, the most elaborate sensory organs. They're also the ones that are out there kind of more exposed more than the other two groups. So it kind of makes sense that they're going to have those same kinds of structures. And a lot of times they're predatory too, and that means they need to have some sensory structures in order to locate their prey. This group is kind of cool in terms of reproductive biology in that it only has gonads during the reproductive season, which really, if you think about it, from our perspective as humans, it's kind of weird. But from an overall energetic perspective, evolutionarily speaking, it's actually pretty smart. Because, maintaining and spending energy to keep gonads around during parts of the year when you're not going to use them is really kind of inefficient and kind of wasteful For an animal to only grow reproductive organs when it needs them and then reabsorb them when it doesn't need them is actually kind of a smart thing to do. Um, Parapodia are the leg-like structures on the sides of the body. They can be used for swimming or crawling or for defense, and also for gas exchange like we talked about before. Those parapodia then have the chaetae that we talked about a couple of slides ago too. In terms of the polychaetes, most of these are dioecious or gonochoric. They're not going to be of the monoecious type. We see that more especially in the earthworms. This group is definitely one where you find separate male and females. External fertilization, like we've seen a lot in aquatic organisms, and they produce a larval stage called the trochophore, much like some of the mollusks do as well. So just a couple pictures here of some more bristleworms or polychaetes, lugworms if you want to call them that. A lot of times too you'll find these, not so much the animal itself, but the remnants of where it's been. When it burrows down in the sand, it kicks out the sand and it creates a mound around its burrow, almost like a crawfish does if you've ever been down south and you've seen that. Very similar to that kind of a thing. So you'll see these mounds on the ocean floor where lugworms have been burrowing and where that substrate's been kicked out. Riftia is a deep sea tube worm or lugworm that is found in some of the most extreme environments from our perspective as humans, very, very far under the ocean surface. Some of these ocean vents, you find hot water and sulfur compounds going into the water. There are bacteria that feed on those compounds. There are other organisms that feed on the bacteria, and eventually get to the point where you find these big polychaetes, which are the ones that are the top predators in this ecosystem. So really kind of a cool place, unique, nothing else like it on the planet as far as where these things live. All right, now our second class is the class Clitella, and it's going to include two subgroups, the oligochaetes and the hierodinians. So the oligochaetes are what we think of when we think of earthworms. They are terrestrial, there are some species that are freshwater, and there are some species that are marine. The hierodinia are primarily freshwater, although there are also some that are terrestrial, and this is the group that includes the leeches. Now, both of these two groups, the oligochaetes and the hierodinians, are hermaphroditic, but, like I said a few minutes ago, they have to cross-fertilize. They're unable to fertilize themselves. Even though they have both male and female gonads, they must find a partner to reproduce. As leeches have some very elaborate kinds of adaptations to help them do their job well. When they bite, you don't really feel anything. They actually secrete an anesthetic onto your skin, which numbs it before they bite you, so you don't feel it and flinch or swat at them or anything like that. You really don't feel the bite at all when they do bite. Once they've bitten you, they also secrete an anticoagulant from their saliva into the wounds, which prevents the blood from clotting and allows they're able to fill up on blood as fast as they possibly can. And their saliva also includes an antibiotic substance, which helps to protect them from any sorts of pathogens you might be carrying, so you don't actually harm them when they feed on you. So actually kind of an advanced group there. Most hierodinians are terrestrial, or I'm sorry, they're freshwater. On land, those that are terrestrial are those that tend to be detritivores. They feed on dead leaf litter and animal matter and those kinds of things. They're not actually parasites at all. Those that are aquatic are the ones that tend to be more of the parasitic type, usually freshwater, and they're also very, very specific. So there's only a very few species of leech that will actually bite a human. Most leeches will attach to a human in order to hang on, but very, very few will bite. And so they actually go by the chemistry of the surface they're attached to when it comes time for them to decide if they're going to bite whatever it is they're attached to. If you pick up a fish leech or a turtle leech and put it on your skin and wait for it to bite you, it won't do it because it doesn't even recognize you as food. You might as well have put it onto your textbook. As far as it's concerned, it's not going to find much nourishment in you, so it just wants to go on its way and find its actual host. The clitellum is a structure which is on all of the clitellodons, both the oligochaetes and the hierodinians. We talked about it before. It's that wide band on the outside of the body. It's used to secrete that mucus cocoon when it's time for the animal to lay its eggs. Oligochaetes, like we mentioned, all three habitats, not much cephalization, hermaphroditic, but with obligate cross-fertilization. And these guys actually don't have parapodia like the polychaetes do, and really the hierodinians don't either. They have a few chaetae which extend from their body wall so that when they're burrowing, for those that burrow, they're able to anchor a certain part of the body in place, move the rest of the body forward, and then repeat that kind of sequence again. Leeches, like I said, are mostly freshwater. They're dorsoventrally flattened, which is a really common thing that we see in ectoparasites. They're able to kind of get snug right up against the surface of the skin or whatever it is they're feeding on and lay flat, so they're actually fairly hard to remove once they've kind of settled in place. This is a group that only produces a clitellum during the breeding season, unlike the oligochaetes, which have it year-round. Earthworms, if you find one, always have a clitellum. Doesn't matter what kind they are or where they are. When it is, they're going to have a clitellum. But leeches only have that structure during the breeding season, which again kind of makes sense. No point in having it and maintaining it if you're not going to be using it. Let's see. We have suckers on both ends of the body. So when they attach at both ends of the animal's body through a sucker type structure, which is actually fairly securely going to attach the animal to its substrate. They're actually fairly hard to remove if you have one attached to you. And we talked about the different niches versus, detritivores versus ectoparasites and so forth. This group doesn't really have much in the way of chaetae either because they're going to be a lot of aquatic type species. There's really not much need for those bristles to have on the outside of the body. So just a few other pictures here of some hybridinians. For most of these pictures, this guy up here is an oligochaete, of course, earthworm. Something else that you don't really realize a lot of the time is that earthworms actually are, all of them, invasive in this part of the world. There are 0 native species of earthworms. They're all established and invasive species that are actually quite harmful to the natural ecosystem. During the last glacier event, which is around 18,000 years ago, as glaciers moved south through this part of the world, they scraped away the soil, and any earthworms that would have been present, native earthworms that were present, would have been scraped away and killed as well. So when the glaciers receded, what they left behind was just plain old bedrock. There's no soil. There's no place for an oligochaete to make a living. There were no earthworms following the last glaciation. It wasn't until humans started moving soil around and started doing things like fishing and using worms as bait and releasing them when they were done for the extras they had left, whatever, that earthworms began to become invasive. Now, earthworms are very, very good for a garden because they do aerate the soil. Typically for an oligochaete, what they'll do is they'll move through the soil. They will ingest soil particles. They will digest any organic matter with those soil particles. And then what they excrete, their waste, is basically bare mineral soil, abiotic nutrients that can be used by other things. So not only do they mix in nutrients to the soil, they also provide burrows, which then allow for aeration of the soil as well. So for a garden, they're great. But in the natural ecosystem, in the forest, in a prairie, that kind of a thing, actually very destructive. And if you've got more questions about that, if you're not sure what that means, you can ask. I don't want to get into it too much more right now, but they're not always as beneficial as what people think. All right, so for the rest of these slides, we are actually not going to cover these. So I just want to make a point to say that we're not covering these because I know you have them in the notes, but I decided to take them out. So with that, I'm going to wrap up this last section on the coelomate invertebrates, and we're going to pick up our next section on the chordates, which includes also the vertebrates, including humans.